my name is Shannon Brewer. I'm a senior attorney at Hill and Ponton, and I'm going to talk to you today about service connecting post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, for combat veterans. Let me start by reminding our non-combat veterans, though, that PTSD is not limited to combat. We talked to a surprising number of veterans, non-combat veterans, who have never filed a claim because they told us they didn't think they were entitled to anything because they weren't in combat. Trauma can happen to anyone, and it doesn't have to be combat related to get VA benefits. So please do go ahead and file your claims. If you suffered a traumatic event in service and you've developed mental health symptoms as a result of that event, you're entitled to benefits. Now, back to our combat veterans, the standard for service connection for all claims is the same. It's an incident in service, a current disability, and a link between those two, a nexus. For combat veterans who necessarily served in the chaos of a combat environment where there wasn't time to document everything that happened, and it may be hard to prove that anything happened specifically, VA has eased the burden of proof for the first step, the incident in service, not to give combat veterans an advantage, but to level the playing field so that they are starting off the same as everyone else. Remember that the presumption does not apply for all events that happen to that veteran during their military career. The in-service incident must be something that happened during the course of combat, a hostile encounter with the enemy, for the presumption to apply. So what this means is that for a combat veteran, a veteran's statement alone can be enough to prove the occurrence of an in-service incident, the stressor or the traumatic event that caused the PTSD. You can find the language for this presumption under Regulation 3.304 F2 if you're interested in reading more about it. Also, 3.304 D is for non-PTSD combat claims. Now, the presumption is not a free pass. The first thing a veteran has to do to qualify for the presumption is to prove that he or she is a combat veteran, that they engaged in combat with the enemy. And sometimes that's easy. Sometimes that's in your service records, and sometimes it isn't. Serving in a combat zone isn't necessarily enough, but if you served in a combat zone and you have a combat MOS, then it probably is. Or if you were awarded a Purple Heart or you have a combat infantryman badge, this is going to be easier for you. Those are considered proof of combat. Also, on that note, be aware that if you have a Purple Heart, you can expedite your claim with the VA. They will consider that quicker if you have a Purple Heart. Buddy statements from others in your unit can also establish that you engaged in direct combat. You can have people that served with you that know you were in combat, they were in combat with you, they can just write a letter stating what happened. And if that supports your statement that you are a combat veteran, then you can get the presumption. Now, whether or not you are a combat veteran is not an issue with the reduced standard of proof. But once you establish that you were in combat, VA has to look at your statement as being enough to establish your PTSD stressor. They have to presume that what you are saying is true and presume that your stressor did happen. That's not an absolute. It helps. If there is evidence that your stressor did not occur, then VA doesn't have to give you that presumption. Or if your statement isn't consistent with the circumstances that you were serving under, VA could still deny. A simple example, just to make that point, if you were serving in a desert, but you claim that your stressor involved a snowstorm, probably not consistent with the circumstances of your service. But once you've proved that you are a combat veteran, VA is ordinarily going to accept that your combat stressor did happen, even if there's no official records or supporting evidence. And if you have a current diagnosis of PTSD, and your PTSD is connected by your doctor to your in-service incident, then your PTSD is going to be service connected. Now, what if you served in a combat zone, but you didn't actually participate in combat? You're not necessarily out of luck here either, but the language is going to be a little different. So veterans who served in a combat zone but didn't actually engage in combat, they can still be traumatized by that service. Just to give you some statistics, from Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Army soldiers, for instance, 93% of them report being shot at. 86% received rocket or mortar fire. 86% knew someone who was killed or accidentally or seriously injured. The numbers for Marines are slightly higher. So just being there can be a trauma. So in addition to the veterans who are considered combat veterans for purposes of the presumption, VA also lowered the standard of proof for veterans who served in the combat zone under Regulation 304F3. If a veteran's stressor is related to fear of hostile military or terrorist activity, and if a VA psychiatrist or psychologist confirms that the stressor is adequate to support a diagnosis of PTSD and provides a nexus, then VA will they will accept the stressor as having happened even without other sources which corroborate the veteran's statement. I'll give you a definition. I'm going to read this so I don't get this wrong. What VA considers hostile military or terrorist activity. It's a veteran who experienced, witnessed, or was confronted with an event or circumstance that actually involved threatened or actual death or serious injury, or a threat to the physical integrity of the veteran or others. They give some examples, such as potential improvised explosive device, vehicle embedded explosive device, incoming artillery, rocket, or mortar fire, grenade, small arms fire, including suspected sniper fire, or an attack on a friendly military aircraft. And if you have those circumstances, even though you weren't, they might not consider you directly in combat, you were still affected by being in that combat zone. I read that out to you just so that you'll know exactly, what kind of things VA is considering are hostile military or terrorist activity. So be aware that though PTSD stressors aren't always documented, VA does recognize that, and they have eased the burden slightly if you are a combat veteran or you served in a combat zone with fear of military action against you. Thank you for your service.